Chapter 35 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 35. Arriving in England, Martin witnesses a ceremony, from which he derives the cheering information that he has not been forgotten in his absence. It was midday and high water in the English port for which the Screw was bound, when, borne in gallantly upon the fullness of the tide, she let go her anchor in the river. Bright as the scene was, fresh and full of motion, airy, free, and sparkling, it was nothing to the life and exultation in the breasts of the two travellers, at sight of the old churches, roofs, and darkened chimney-stacks of home. The distant roar that swelled up hoarsely from the busy streets was music in their ears. The lines of people gazing from the wharves were friends held dear. The canopy of smoke that overhung the town was brighter and more beautiful to them than if the richest silks of Persia had been waving in the air. And though the water, going on its glistening track, turned, ever and again, aside, to dance and sparkle round great ships and heave them up, and leaped from off the blades of oars, a shower of diving diamonds, and wantoned with the idle boats, and swiftly passed, in many a sportive chase, through obdurate old iron rings, set deep into the stonework of the quays, not even it was half so buoyant and so restless as their fluttering hearts, when yearning to set foot once more on native ground. A year had passed since those same spires and roofs had faded from their eyes. It seemed to them a dozen years. Some trifling changes here and there they called to mind, and wondered that they were so few and slight. In health and fortune, prospect and resource, they came back poorer men than they had gone away. But it was home, and though home is a name, a word, it is a strong one, stronger than magician ever spoke or spirit answered to in strongest conjuration. Being set ashore with very little money in their pockets and no definite plan of operation in their heads, they sought out a cheap tavern, where they regaled upon a smoking steak and certain flowing mugs of beer, as only men just landed from the sea can revel in the generous dainties of the earth. When they had feasted, as two grateful tempered giants might have done, they stirred the fire, drew back the glowing curtain from the window, and making each a sofa for himself, by union of the great unwieldy chairs, gazed blissfully into the street. Even the street was made a fairy street by being half hidden in an atmosphere of steak and strong, stout, stand-up English beer. For on the window-glass hung such a mist that Mr. Tapley was obliged to rise and wipe it with his handkerchief before the passengers appeared like common mortals. And even then a spiral little cloud went curling up from their two glasses of hot grog, which nearly hid them from each other. It was one of those unaccountable little rooms which are never seen anywhere but in a tavern, and are supposed to have got into taverns by reason of the facilities afforded to the architect for getting drunk while engaged in their construction. It had more corners in it than the brain of an obstinate man, was full of mad closets into which nothing could be put that was not specially invented and made for that purpose, had mysterious shelvings and bulkheads, and indications of staircases in the ceiling, and was elaborately provided with a bell that rung in the room itself, about 2 feet from the handle, and had no connection whatever with any other part of the establishment. It was a little below the pavement, and abutted close upon it, so that passengers grated against the window panes with their buttons, and scraped it with their baskets, and fearful boys, suddenly coming between a thoughtful guest and the light, derided him, or put out their tongues as if he were a physician, or made white knobs on the ends of their noses by flattening the same against the glass, and vanished awfully like spectres. Martin and Mark sat looking at the people as they passed, debating every now and then what their first step should be. "We want to see Miss Mary, of course," said Mark. "Of course," said Martin, "but I don't know where she is. Not having had the heart to write in our distress, you yourself thought silence most advisable, and consequently, never having heard from her since we left New York the first time, I don't know where she is, my good fellow." "My opinion is, sir," returned Mark, that what we've got to do is to travel straight to the Dragon. There's no need for you to go there where you're known unless you like. You may stop 10 miles short of it. I'll go on. Mrs. Lupin will tell me all the news. Mr. Pinch will give me every information that we want, and right glad Mr. Pinch will be to do it. My proposal is to set off walking this afternoon, to stop when we are tired, to get a lift when we can, to walk when we can't, to do it at once and do it cheap." "Unless we do it cheap, we shall have some difficulty in doing it at all," said Martin, pulling out the bank and telling it over in his hand. "The greater reason for losing no time, sir," replied Mark. "Whereas, when you've seen the young lady and know what state of mind the old gentleman's in, and all about it, then you'll know what to do next." "No doubt," said Martin. "You are quite right." They were raising their glasses to their lips when their hands stopped midway, and their gaze was arrested by a figure which slowly, very slowly and reflectively, passed the window at that moment. Mr. Pecksniff, placid, calm but proud, honestly proud, dressed with peculiar care, smiling with even more than usual blandness, pondering on the beauties of his art with a mild abstraction from all sordid thoughts, and gently travelling across the disc as if he were a figure in a magic lantern. As Mr. Pecksniff passed, a person coming in the opposite direction stopped to look after him with great interest and respect, almost with veneration; and the landlord, bouncing out of the house as if he had seen him too, joined this person and spoke to him, and shook his head gravely, and looked after Mr. Pecksniff likewise. Martin and Mark sat staring at each other as if they could not believe it. But there stood the landlord and the other man still. In spite of the indignation with which this glimpse of Mr. Pecksniff had inspired him, Martin could not help laughing heartily. Neither could Mark. "We must inquire into this," said Martin. "Ask the landlord in, Mark." Mr. Tapley retired for that purpose, and immediately returned with their large-headed host in safe convoy. "Pray, landlord," said Martin, "who is that gentleman who passed just now, and whom you were looking after?" The landlord poked the fire, as if, in his desire to make the most of his answer, he had become indifferent even to the price of coals, and putting his hands in his pockets, said, after inflating himself to give still further effect to his reply, "That, gentlemen, is the great Mr. Pecksniff, the celebrated architect, gentlemen." He looked from one to the other while he said it, as if he were ready to assist the first man who might be overcome by the intelligence. "The great Mr. Pecksniff, the celebrated architect, gentlemen," said the landlord, "has come down here to help lay the first stone of a new and splendid public building." "Is it to be built from his designs?" asked Martin. "The great Mr. Pecksniff, the celebrated architect, gentlemen," returned the landlord, who seemed to have an unspeakable delight in the repetition of these words, "carried off the first premium and will erect the building." "Who lays the stone?" asked Martin. "Our member has come down express," returned the landlord. "No scrubs would do for no such a purpose. Nothing less would satisfy our directors than our member in the House of Commons, who has returned upon the gentlemanly interest." "Which interest is that?" asked Martin. "What, don't you know?" returned the landlord. It was quite clear the landlord didn't. They always told him at election time that it was the gentlemanly side, and he immediately put on his top boots and voted for it. "When does the ceremony take place?" asked Martin. "This day," replied the landlord. Then, pulling out his watch, he added impressively, "almost this minute." Martin hastily inquired whether there was any possibility of getting in to witness it, and finding that there would be no objection to the admittance of any decent person, unless indeed the ground were full, hurried off with Mark as hard as they could go. They were fortunate enough to squeeze themselves into a famous corner on the ground, where they could see all that passed without much dread of being beheld by Mr. Pecksniff in return. They were not a minute too soon, for as they were in the act of congratulating each other, a great noise was heard at some distance, and everybody looked towards the gate. Several ladies prepared their pocket handkerchiefs for waving, and a stray teacher belonging to the charity school, being much cheered by mistake, was immensely groaned at when detected. "Perhaps he has Tom Pinch with him," Martin whispered Mr. Tapley. "It would be rather too much of a treat for him, wouldn't it, sir?" whispered Mr. Tapley in return. There was no time to discuss the probabilities either way, for the charity school, in clean linen, came filing in 2 and 2, so much to the self-approval of all the people present who didn't subscribe to it, that many of them shed tears. A band of music followed, led by a conscientious drummer who never left off. Then came a great many gentlemen with wands in their hands and bows on their breasts, whose share in the proceedings did not appear to be distinctly laid down, and who trod upon each other and blocked up the entry for a considerable period. These were followed by the mayor and corporation, all clustering round the member for the gentlemanly interest, who had the great Mr. Pecksniff, the celebrated architect, on his right hand, and conversed with him familiarly as they came along. Then the ladies waved their handkerchiefs, and the gentlemen their hats, and the charity children shrieked, and the member for the gentlemanly interest bowed. Silence being restored, the member for the gentlemanly interest rubbed his hands and wagged his head and looked about him pleasantly, and there was nothing this member did at which some lady or other did not burst into an ecstatic waving of her pocket-handkerchief. When he looked up at the stone, they said, "How graceful!" When he peeped into the hole, they said, "How condescending!" When he chatted with the mayor, they said, "How easy!" When he folded his arms, they cried with one accord, "How statesmanlike!" Mr. Pecksniff was observed too, closely. When he talked to the mayor, they said, "Oh, really, what a courtly man he was!" When he laid his hand upon the mason's shoulder, giving him directions, how pleasant his demeanour to the working classes! Just the sort of man who made their toil a pleasure to them, poor dear souls. But now a silver trowel was brought, and when the member for the gentlemanly interest, tucking up his coat sleeve, did a little sleight of hand with the mortar, the air was rent, so loud was the applause. The workmanlike manner in which he did it was amazing. No one could conceive where such a gentlemanly creature could have picked the knowledge up. When he had made a kind of dirt pie under the direction of the mason, they brought a little vase containing coins, the which the member for the gentlemanly interest jingled, as if he were going to conjure. Whereat they said, "How droll! How cheerful! What a flow of spirits!" This put into its place, an ancient scholar read the inscription, which was in Latin, not in English. That would never do. It gave great satisfaction, especially every time there was a good long substantive in the third declension, ablative case, with an adjective to match, at which periods the assembly became very tender, and were much affected. And now the stone was lowered down into its place, amidst the shouting of the concourse. When it was firmly fixed, the member for the gentlemanly interest struck upon it thrice with the handle of the trowel, as if inquiring, with a touch of humour, whether anybody was at home. Mr. Pecksniff then unrolled his plans, prodigious plans they were, and people gathered round to look at and admire them. Martin, who had been fretting himself, quite unnecessarily, as Mark thought, during the whole of these proceedings, could no longer restrain his impatience, but stepping forward among several others, looked straight over the shoulder of the unconscious Mr. Pecksniff at the designs and plans he had unrolled. He returned to Mark, boiling with rage. "Why, what's the matter, sir?" cried Mark. "Matter? This is my building." "Your building, sir," said Mark. "My grammar school. I invented it. I did it all. He has only put 4 windows in, the villain, and spoilt it." Mark could hardly believe it at first, but being assured that it was really so, actually held him to prevent his interference foolishly until his temporary heat was past. In the meantime, the member addressed the company on the gratifying deed which he had just performed. He said that since he had sat in Parliament to represent the gentlemanly interest of that town, and he might add the lady interest, he hoped, besides, pocket-handkerchiefs, it had been his pleasant duty to come among them and to raise his voice on their behalf in another place, pocket-handkerchiefs and laughter, often. But he had never come among them, and had never raised his voice with half such pure, such deep, such unalloyed delight as now. The present occasion, he said, will ever be memorable to me, not only for the reasons I have assigned, but because it has afforded me an opportunity of becoming personally known to a gentleman. Here he pointed the trowel at Mr. Pecksniff, who was greeted with vociferous cheering, and laid his hand upon his heart. "To a gentleman who, I am happy to believe, will reap both distinction and profit from this field, whose fame had previously penetrated to me, as to whose ears has it not? But whose intellectual countenance I never had the distinguished honour to behold until this day, and whose intellectual conversation I had never before the improving pleasure to enjoy." Everybody seemed very glad of this, and applauded more than ever. "But I hope my honourable friend," said the gentlemanly member, "of course," he added, "if he will allow me to call him so," and of course Mr. Pecksniff bowed, "will give me many opportunities of cultivating the knowledge of him, and that I may have the extraordinary gratification of reflecting, in after time, that I laid on this day 2 first stones, both belonging to structures which shall last my life." Great cheering again. All this time Martin was cursing Mr. Pecksniff up hill and down dale. "My friends," said Mr. Pecksniff in reply, "my duty is to build, not speak; to act, not talk; to deal with marble, stone, and brick, not language. I am very much affected. God bless you." This address, pumped out apparently from Mr. Pecksniff's very heart, brought the enthusiasm to its highest pitch. The pocket handkerchiefs were waved again. The charity children were admonished to grow up Pecksniffs, every boy among them. The corporation, gentlemen with wands, member for the gentlemanly interest, all cheered for Mr. Pecksniff. "3 cheers for Mr. Pecksniff! 3 more for Mr. Pecksniff! 3 more for Mr. Pecksniff, gentlemen, if you please! 1 more, gentlemen, for Mr. Pecksniff, and let it be a good one to finish with!" In short, Mr. Pecksniff was supposed to have done a great work, and was very kindly, courteously, and generously rewarded. When the procession moved away, and Martin and Mark were left almost alone upon the ground, his merits and a desire to acknowledge them formed the common topic. He was only second to the gentlemanly member. "Compare the fellow's situation to-day with ours," said Martin bitterly. "Lord bless you, sir," cried Mark, "what's the use? Some architects are clever at making foundations, and some architects are clever at building on 'em when they're made. But it'll all come right in the end, sir. It'll all come right." "And in the meantime—" began Martin. "In the meantime, as you say, sir, we have a deal to do, and far to go. So sharp's the word, and jolly." "You are the best master in the world, Mark," said Martin, "and I will not be a bad scholar if I can help it. I am resolved. So come, best foot foremost, old fellow." End of chapter 35. Chapter 36, Part 1 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 36. Tom Pinch departs to seek his fortune. What he finds at starting. Part 1. Oh, what a different town Salisbury was in Tom Pinch's eyes, to be sure, when the substantial Pecksniff of his heart melted away into an idle dream. He possessed the same faith in the wonderful shops, the same intensified appreciation of the mystery and wickedness of the place, made the same exalted estimate of its wealth, population, and resources, and yet it was not the old city nor anything like it. He walked into the market while they were getting breakfast ready for him at the inn, and though it was the same market as of old, crowded by the same buyers and sellers, brisk with the same business, noisy with the same confusion of tongues and cluttering of fowls and coops, fair with the same display of rolls of butter, newly made, set forth in linen cloths of dazzling whiteness, green with the same fresh snow of dewy vegetables, dainty with the same array in higgler's baskets of small shaving glasses, laces, braces, trouser straps, and hardware, savory with the same unstinted show of delicate pig's feet, and pies made precious by the pork that once had walked upon them, still it was strangely changed to Tom. For in the center of the market-place he missed a statue he had set up there, as in all other places of his personal resort, and it looked cold and bare without that ornament. The change lay no deeper than this, for Tom was far from being sage enough to know that, having been disappointed in one man, it would have been a strictly rational and eminently wise proceeding to have revenged himself upon mankind in general by mistrusting them one and all. Indeed, this piece of justice, though it is upheld by the authority of divers profound poets and honourable men, bears a nearer resemblance to the justice of that good vizier in the 1001 Nights, who issues orders for the destruction of all the porters in Baghdad, because one of that unfortunate fraternity is supposed to have misconducted himself, than to any logical, not to say Christian, system of conduct known to the world in later times. Tom had so long been used to steep the Pecksniff of his fancy in his tea, and spread him out upon his toast, and take him as a relish with his beer, that he made but a poor breakfast on the first morning after his expulsion. Nor did he much improve his appetite for dinner by seriously considering his own affairs, and taking counsel thereon with his friend, the organist's assistant. The organist's assistant gave it as his decided opinion that whatever Tom did he must go to London, for there was no place like it, which may be true in the main, though hardly perhaps in itself a sufficient reason for Tom's going there. But Tom had thought of London before, and had coupled with it thoughts of his sister and of his old friend John Westlock, whose advice he naturally felt disposed to seek in this important crisis of his fortunes. To London, therefore, he resolved to go, and he went away to the coach office at once to secure his place. The coach being already full, he was obliged to postpone his departure until the next night. But even this circumstance had its bright side as well as its dark one, for though it threatened to reduce his poor purse with unexpected country charges, it afforded him an opportunity of writing to Mrs. Lupin and appointing his box to be brought to the old finger-post at the old time, which would enable him to take that treasure with him to the metropolis and save the expense of its carriage. "So," said Tom, comforting himself, "it's very nearly as broad as it's long." And it cannot be denied that when he had made up his mind to even this extent, he felt an unaccustomed sense of freedom, a vague and indistinct impression of holiday-making, which was very luxurious. He had his moments of depression and anxiety, and they were, with good reason, pretty numerous. But still it was wonderfully pleasant to reflect that he was his own master and could plan and scheme for himself. It was startling, thrilling, vast, difficult to understand. It was a stupendous truth, teeming with responsibility and self-distrust. But in spite of all his cares, it gave a curious relish to the viands at the inn, and interposed a dreamy haze between him and his prospects, in which they sometimes showed to magical advantage. In this unsettled state of mind, Tom went once more to bed in the low four-poster, to the same immovable surprise of the effigies of the former landlord and the fat ox, and in this condition passed the whole of the succeeding day. When the coach came round at last, with London blazoned in letters of gold upon the boot, it gave Tom such a turn that he was half disposed to run away. But he didn't do it, for he took his seat upon the box instead, and looking down upon the 4 greys, felt as if he were another grey himself, or at all events a part of the turnout, and was quite confused by the novelty and splendour of his situation. And really it might have confused a less modest man than Tom to find himself sitting next that coachman, for of all the swells that ever flourished a whip professionally, he might have been elected emperor. He didn't handle his gloves like another man, but put them on, even when he was standing on the pavement quite detached from the coach, as if the 4 greys were, somehow or other, at the ends of the fingers. It was the same with his hat. He did things with his hat which nothing but an unlimited knowledge of horses and the wildest freedom of the road could ever have made him perfect in. Valuable little parcels were brought to him with particular instructions, and he pitched them into this hat and stuck it on again as if the laws of gravity did not admit of such an event as its being knocked off or blown off, and nothing like an accident could befall it. The guard, too. 70 breezy miles a day were written in his very whiskers. His manners were a canter, his conversation a round trot. He was a fast coach upon a downhill turnpike road. He was all pace. A wagon couldn't have moved slowly with that guard and his key bugle on the top of it. These were all foreshadowings of London, Tom thought, as he sat upon the box and looked about him. Such a coachman and such a guard never could have existed between Salisbury and any other place. The coach was none of your steady-going yokel coaches, but a swaggering, rakish, dissipated London coach, up all night and lying by all day, and leading a devil of a life. It cared no more for Salisbury than if it had been a hamlet. It rattled noisily through the best streets, defied the cathedral, took the worst corners sharpest, went cutting in everywhere, making everything get out of its way, and spun along the open country road, blowing a lively defiance out of its key bugle as its last glad parting legacy. It was a charming evening, mild and bright, and even with the weight upon his mind which arose out of the immensity and uncertainty of London, Tom could not resist a captivating sense of rapid motion through the pleasant air. The four Greys skimmed along as if they liked it quite as well as Tom did. The bugle was in as high spirits as the Greys. The coachman chimed in sometimes with his voice. The wheels hummed cheerfully in unison. The brasswork on the harness was an orchestra of little bells. And thus, as they went clinking, jingling, rattling smoothly on, the whole concern, from the buckles of the leader's coupling reins to the handle of the hind boot, was one great instrument of music. Yo-ho, past hedges, gates and trees, past cottages and barns, and people going home from work. Yo-ho, past donkey chaises drawn aside into the ditch, and empty carts with rampant horses whipped up at a bound upon the little watercourse, and held by struggling carters close to the 5-barred gate, until the coach had passed the narrow turning in the road. Yo-ho, by churches dropped down by themselves in quiet nooks, with rustic burial grounds about them, where the graves are green and daisies sleep, for it is evening, on the bosoms of the dead. Yo-ho, past streams in which the cattle cool their feet, and where the rushes grow, past paddock fences, farms, and rick-yards, past last year's stacks, cut slice by slice away, and showing in the waning light like ruined gables, old and brown. Yo-ho, down the pebbly dip, and through the merry water splash, and up at a canter to the level road again. Yo-ho, yo-ho. Was the box there when they came up to the old finger-post? The box. Was Mrs. Lupin herself? Had she turned out magnificently, as a hostess should, in her own chaise cart? And was she sitting in a mahogany chair, driving her own horse Dragon, who ought to have been called Dumpling, and looking lovely? Did the stage-coach pull up beside her, shaving her very wheel? And even while the guard helped her man up with the trunk, did he send the glad echoes of his bugle careering down the chimneys of the distant Pecksniff, as if the coach expressed its exultation in the rescue of Tom Pinch. "This is kind indeed," said Tom, bending down to shake hands with her. "I didn't mean to give you this trouble." "Trouble, Mr. Pinch!" cried the hostess of the Dragon. "Well, it's a pleasure to you, I know," said Tom, squeezing her hand heartily. "Is there any news?" The hostess shook her head. "Say you saw me," said Tom, "and that I was very bold and cheerful, and not a bit downhearted, and that I entreated her to be the same, for all is certain to come right at last. Good-bye." "You'll write when you get settled, Mr. Pinch?" said Mrs. Lupin. "When I get settled?" cried Tom, with an involuntary opening of his eyes. "Oh, yes, I'll write when I get settled. Perhaps I had better write before, because I may find that it takes a little time to settle myself, not having too much money, and having only one friend. I shall give your love to the friend, by the way. You were always great with Mr. Westlock, you know. Good-bye." "Good-bye," said Mrs. Lupin, hastily producing a basket with a long bottle sticking out of it. "Take this. Good-bye." "Do you want me to carry it to London for you?" cried Tom. She was already turning the chaise cart round. "No, no," said Mrs. Lupin. "It's only a little something for refreshment on the road. Sit fast, Jack. Drive on, sir. All right. Good-bye." She was a quarter of a mile off before Tom collected himself, and then he was waving his hand lustily, and so was she. "And that's the last of the old finger-post," thought Tom, straining his eyes, "where I have so often stood to see this very coach go by, and where I have parted with so many companions. I used to compare this coach to some great monster that appeared at certain times to bear my friends away into the world, and now it's bearing me away to seek my fortune, heaven knows where and how. It made Tom melancholy to picture himself walking up the lane and back to Pecksniff's as of old, and being melancholy he looked downwards at the basket on his knee, which he had for the moment forgotten. "She is the kindest and most considerate creature in the world," thought Tom. "Now I know that she particularly told that man of hers not to look at me, on purpose to prevent my throwing him a shilling. I had it ready for him all the time, and he never once looked towards me. Whereas that man naturally, for I know him very well, would have done nothing but grin and stare. Upon my word, the kindness of people perfectly melts me." Here he caught the coachman's eye. The coachman winked. "Remarkable fine woman for her time of life," said the coachman. "I quite agree with you," returned Tom. "So she is." "Finer than many a young un, I mean to say," observed the coachman. "Eh?" "Than many a young one," Tom assented. "I don't care for 'em myself when they're too young," remarked the coachman. This was a matter of taste which Tom did not feel himself called upon to discuss. "You'll seldom find 'em possessing correct opinions about refreshment, for instance, when they're too young, you know," said the coachman. "A woman must have arrived at maturity before her mind's equal to coming provided with a basket like that." "Perhaps you would like to know what it contains," said Tom, smiling. As the coachman only laughed, and as Tom was curious himself, he unpacked it and put the articles one by one upon the footboard. A cold roast fowl, a packet of ham in slices, a crusty loaf, a piece of cheese, a paper of biscuits, half a dozen apples, a knife, some butter, a screw of salt, and a bottle of old sherry. There was a letter besides, which Tom put in his pocket. The coachman was so earnest in his approval of Mrs. Lupin's provident habits, and congratulated Tom so warmly on his good fortune, that Tom felt it necessary, for the lady's sake, to explain that the basket was a strictly platonic basket, and had merely been presented to him in the way of friendship. When he had made the statement with perfect gravity, for he felt it incumbent on him to disabuse the mind of this lax rover of any incorrect impressions on the subject, he signified that he would be happy to share the gifts with him, and proposed that they should attack the basket in a spirit of good fellowship at any time in the course of the night which the coachman's experience and knowledge of the road might suggest as being best adapted to the purpose. From this time they chatted so pleasantly together that, although Tom knew infinitely more of unicorns than horses, the coachman informed his friend the guard at the end of the next stage that, rum as the box seat looked, he was as good a one to go in pint of conversation as ever he'd wish to sit by. Yo-ho among the gathering shades, making of no account the deep reflections of the trees, but scampering on through light and darkness, all the same as if the light of London 50 miles away were quite enough to travel by, and some to spare. Yo-ho beside the village green, where cricket players linger yet, and every little indentation made in the fresh grass by bat or wicket, ball or player's foot, sheds out its perfume on the night. Away with 4 fresh horses from the bald-faced stag, where topers congregate about the door admiring, and the last team, with traces hanging loose, go roaming off towards the pond, until observed and shouted after by a dozen throats, while volunteering boys pursue them. Now with a clattering of hoofs, and striking out of fiery sparks, across the old stone bridge, and down again into the shadowy road, and through the open gate, and far away, away into the wold. Yo-ho. Yo-ho behind there, stop that bugle for a moment. Come creeping over to the front along the coach roof guard, and make one at this basket. Not that we slacken in our pace the while, not we. We rather put the bits of blood upon their mettle, for the greater glory of the snack. Ah, it is long since this bottle of old wine was brought into contact with the mellow breath of night, you may depend, and rare good stuff it is to wet a bugler's whistle with. Only try it. Don't be afraid of turning up your finger, Bill. Another pull. Now take your breath and try the bugle, Bill. There's music. There's a tone. Over the hills and far away, indeed. Yo-ho! The skittish mare is all alive tonight. Yo-ho! Yo-ho! See the bright moon, high up before we know it, making the earth reflect the objects on its breast like water. Hedges, trees, low cottages, church steeples, blighted stumps, and flourishing young slips have all grown vain upon the sudden, and mean to contemplate their own fair images till morning. The poplars yonder rustle that their quivering leaves may see themselves upon the ground. Not so the oak. Trembling does not become him, and he watches himself in his stout old burly steadfastness, without the motion of a twig. The moss-grown gate, ill poised upon its creaking hinges, crippled and decayed, swings to and fro before its glass like some fantastic dowager, while our own ghostly likeness travels on, yo-ho, yo-ho, through ditch and brake, upon the ploughed land and the smooth, along the steep hillside and steeper wall, as if it were a phantom hunter. Clouds, too, and a mist upon the hollow, not a dull fog that hides it, but a light, airy, gauze-like mist, which, in our eyes of modest admiration, gives a new charm to the beauties it is spread before, as real gauze has done ere now, and would again so please you, though we were the Pope. Yo-ho! Why, now we travel like the moon herself, hiding this minute in a grove of trees, next minute in a patch of vapor. Emerging now upon our broad clear course, withdrawing now, but always dashing on, our journey is a counterpart of hers. Yo-ho! A match against the moon. The beauty of the night is hardly felt when day comes rushing up. Yo-ho! 2 stages, and the country roads are almost changed to a continuous street. Yo-ho! Past market gardens, rows of houses, villas, crescents, terraces, and squares. Past wagons, coaches, carts. Past early workmen, late stragglers, drunken men, and sober carriers of loads. Past brick and mortar in its every shape, and in among the rattling pavements where a jaunty seat upon a coach is not so easy to preserve. Yo-ho! Down countless turnings and through countless mazy ways, until an old inn-yard is gained, and Tom Pinch, getting down quite stunned and giddy, is in London. 5 minutes before the time, too, said the driver, as he received his fee of Tom. Upon my word, said Tom, I should not have minded very much if we had been 5 hours after it, for at this early hour I don't know where to go or what to do with myself. Don't they expect you, then? Inquired the driver. Who? Said Tom. Why, them, returned the driver. His mind was so clearly running on the assumption of Tom's having come to town to see an extensive circle of anxious relations and friends, that it would have been pretty hard work to undeceive him. Tom did not try. He cheerfully evaded the subject, and going into the inn fell fast asleep before a fire in one of the public rooms opening from the yard. When he awoke, the people in the house were all astir, so he washed and dressed himself, to his great refreshment after the journey, and, it being by that time 8 o'clock, went forth at once to see his old friend John. John Westlock lived in Furnival's Inn, High Holborn, which was within a quarter of an hour's walk of Tom's starting point, but seemed a long way off by reason of his going 2 or 3 miles out of the straight road to make a short cut. When at last he arrived outside John's door, 2 stories up, he stood faltering with his hand upon the knocker, and trembled from head to foot. For he was rendered very nervous by the thought of having to relate what had fallen out between himself and Pecksniff, and he had a misgiving that John would exult fearfully in the disclosure. But it must be made, thought Tom, sooner or later, and I had better get it over. Rat-tat. I'm afraid that's not a London knock, thought Tom. It didn't sound bold. Perhaps that's the reason why nobody answers the door. It is quite certain that nobody came, and that Tom stood looking at the knocker, wondering whereabouts in the neighborhood a certain gentleman resided who was roaring out to somebody, "Come in," with all his might. Bless my soul, thought Tom at last, perhaps he lives here and is calling to me. I never thought of that. Can I open the door from the outside, I wonder? Yes, to be sure I can. To be sure he could, by turning the handle, and to be sure when he did turn it, the same voice came rushing out, crying, "Why don't you come in? Come in, do you hear? What are you standing there for?" quite violently. Tom stepped from the little passage into the room from which these sounds proceeded, and had barely caught a glimpse of a gentleman in a dressing gown and slippers, with his boots beside him ready to put on, sitting at his breakfast with a newspaper in his hand, when the said gentleman, at the imminent hazard of oversetting his tea-table, made a plunge at Tom and hugged him. "Why, Tom, my boy!" cried the gentleman. "Tom!" "How glad I am to see you, Mr. Westlock," said Tom Pinch, shaking both his hands, and trembling more than ever. "How kind you are!" "Mr. Westlock!" repeated John. "What do you mean by that, Pinch? You have not forgotten my Christian name, I suppose?" "No, John, no, I have not forgotten," said Thomas Pinch. "Good gracious me, how kind you are!" "I never saw such a fellow in all my life!" cried John. "What do you mean by saying that over and over again? What did you expect me to be, I wonder? Here, sit down, Tom, and be a reasonable creature. How are you, my boy? I am delighted to see you." "And I am delighted to see you," said Tom. "It's mutual, of course," returned Tom. "It always was, I hope. If I had known you had been coming, Tom, I would have had something for breakfast. I would rather have such a surprise than the best breakfast in the world myself. But yours is another case, and I have no doubt you are as hungry as a hunter. You must make out as well as you can, Tom, and we'll recompense ourselves at dinner time. You take sugar, I know. I recollect the sugar at Pecksniff's. Ha, ha, ha! How is Pecksniff? When did you come to town? Do begin at something or other, Tom. There are only scraps here, but they are not at all bad. Boar's head potted. Try it, Tom. Make a beginning, whatever you do. What an old blade you are! I am delighted to see you." While he delivered himself of these words in a state of great commotion, John was constantly running backwards and forwards to and from the closet, bringing out all sorts of things in pots, scooping extraordinary quantities of tea out of the caddy, dropping French rolls into his boots, pouring hot water over the butter, and making a variety of similar mistakes without disconcerting himself in the least. "There," said John, sitting down for the 50th time, and instantly starting up again to make some other addition to the breakfast. "Now we are as well off as we are likely to be till dinner. And now let us have the news, Tom. Imprimis, how's Pecksniff?" "I don't know how he is," was Tom's grave answer. John Westlock put the teapot down and looked at him in astonishment. "I don't know how he is," said Thomas Pinch, "and saving that I wish him no ill, I don't care. I have left him, John. I have left him forever." "Voluntarily?" "Why, no, for he dismissed me. But I had first found out that I was mistaken in him, and I could not have remained with him under any circumstances. I grieve to say that you were right in your estimate of his character. It may be a ridiculous weakness, John, but it has been very painful and bitter to me to find this out, I do assure you." Tom had no need to direct that appealing look towards his friend, in mild and gentle deprecation of his answering with a laugh. John Westlock would have as soon thought of striking him down upon the floor. "It was all a dream of mine," said Tom, "and it is over. I'll tell you how it happened at some other time. Bear with my folly, John. I do not just now like to think or speak about it." "I swear to you, Tom," returned his friend with great earnestness of manner, after remaining silent for a few moments, "that when I see, as I do now, how deeply you feel this, I don't know whether to be glad or sorry that you have made the discovery at last. I reproach myself with the thought that I ever jested on the subject. I ought to have known better." "My dear friend," said Tom, extending his hand, "it is very generous and gallant in you to receive me and my disclosure in this spirit. It makes me blush to think that I should have felt a moment's uneasiness as I came along. You can't think what a weight is lifted off my mind," said Tom, taking up his knife and fork again, and looking very cheerful. "I shall punish the boar's head dreadfully." The host, thus reminded of his duties, instantly betook himself to piling up all kinds of irreconcilable and contradictory viands in Tom's plate. And a very capital breakfast Tom made, and very much the better for it, Tom felt. "That's all right," said John, after contemplating his visitor's proceedings with infinite satisfaction. "Now, about our plans. You are going to stay with me, of course. Where's your box?" "It's at the inn," said Tom. "I didn't intend—" "Never mind what you didn't intend," John Westlock interposed. "What you did intend is more to the purpose. You intended in coming here to ask my advice, did you not, Tom?" "Certainly." "And to take it when I gave it to you." "Yes," rejoined Tom, smiling, "if it were good advice, which, being yours, I have no doubt it will be." "Very well. Then don't be an obstinate old humbug in the outset, Tom. or I shall shut up shop and dispense none of that invaluable commodity. You are on a visit to me. I wish I had an organ for you, Tom." "So do the gentlemen downstairs and the gentlemen overhead, I have no doubt," was Tom's reply. "Let me see. In the first place, you will wish to see your sister this morning," pursued his friend, "and of course you will like to go there alone. I'll walk part of the way with you and see about a little business of my own, and meet you here again in the afternoon. Put that in your pocket, Tom. It's only the key of the door. If you come home first, you'll want it." "Really," said Tom, "quartering oneself upon a friend in this way—" "Why, there are two keys," interposed John Westlock. "I can't open the door with them both at once, can I? What a ridiculous fellow you are, Tom. Nothing particular you'd like for dinner, is there?" "Oh dear, no," said Tom. "Very well, then you may as well leave it to me. Have a glass of cherry brandy, Tom?" "Not a drop." "What remarkable chambers these are," said Pinch. "There's everything in 'em." "Bless your soul, Tom, nothing but a few little bachelor contrivances, the sort of impromptu arrangements that might have suggested themselves to Philip Quarle or Robinson Crusoe, that's all. What do you say, shall we walk?" "By all means," cried Tom, "as soon as you like." End of Chapter 36, Part 1. Chapter 36, Part 2 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 36, Part 2. Accordingly, John Westlock took the French rolls out of his boots and put his boots on, and dressed himself, giving Tom the paper to read in the meanwhile. When he returned, equipped for walking, he found Tom in a brown study with the paper in his hand. "Dreaming, Tom?" "No," said Mr. Pinch. "No, I have been looking over the advertising sheet, thinking there might be something in it which would be likely to suit me. But as I often think, the strange thing seems to be that nobody is suited. Here are all kinds of employers wanting all sorts of servants, and all sorts of servants wanting all kinds of employers, and they never seem to come together. Here is a gentleman in a public office, in a position of temporary difficulty, who wants to borrow £500. And in the very next advertisement, here is another gentleman who has got exactly that sum to lend. But he'll never lend it to him, John, you'll find. Here is a lady possessing a moderate independence, who wants to board and lodge with a quiet, cheerful family. And here is a family describing themselves in those very words, a quiet, cheerful family, who want exactly such a lady to come and live with them. But she'll never go, John. Neither do any of these single gentlemen who want an airy bedroom with the occasional use of a parlor ever appear to come to terms with these other people who live in a rural situation remarkable for its bracing atmosphere within 5 minutes' walk of the Royal Exchange. Even those letters of the alphabet who are always running away from their friends and being entreated at the tops of columns to come back never do come back, if we may judge from the number of times they are asked to do it and don't. "It really seems," said Tom, relinquishing the paper with a thoughtful sigh, "as if people had the same gratification in printing their complaints as in making them known by word of mouth. As if they found it a comfort and consolation to proclaim, 'I want such and such a thing, and I can't get it, and I don't expect I ever shall.'" John Westlock laughed at the idea, and they went out together. So many years had passed since Tom was last in London, and he had known so little of it then, that his interest in all he saw was very great. He was particularly anxious, among other notorious localities, to have those streets pointed out to him which were appropriated to the slaughter of countrymen, and was quite disappointed to find, after half an hour's walking, that he hadn't had his pocket picked. But on John Westlock's inventing a pickpocket for his gratification, and pointing out a highly respectable stranger as one of that fraternity, he was much delighted. His friend accompanied him to within a short distance of Camberwell, and having put him beyond the possibility of mistaking the wealthy brass and copper founders, left him to make his visit. Arriving before the great bell handle, Tom gave it a gentle pull. The porter appeared. "Pray, does Miss Pinch live here?" said Tom. "Miss Pinch is governess here," replied the porter. At the same time he looked at Tom from head to foot, as if he would have said, "You are a nice man, you are. Where did you come from?" "It's the same young lady," said Tom. "It's quite right. Is she at home?" "I don't know, I'm sure," rejoined the porter. "Do you think you could have the goodness to ascertain?" said Tom. He had quite a delicacy in offering the suggestion, for the possibility of such a step did not appear to present itself to the porter's mind at all. The fact was that the porter, in answering the gate bell, had, according to usage, rung the house bell, for it is as well to do these things in the baronial style while you are about it, and that there the functions of his office had ceased. Being hired to open and shut the gate, and not to explain himself to strangers, he left this little incident to be developed by the footman with the tags, who, at this juncture, called out from the doorsteps, "Hullo there! What are you up to? This way, young man." "Oh," said Tom, hurrying towards him, "I didn't observe that there was anybody else. Pray, is Miss Pinch at home?" "She's in," replied the footman, as much as to say to Tom, "But if you think she has anything to do with the proprietorship of this place, you had better abandon that idea." "I wish to see her, if you please," said Tom. The footman, being a lively young man, happened to have his attention caught at that moment by the flight of a pigeon, in which he took so warm an interest that his gaze was riveted on the bird until it was quite out of sight. He then invited Tom to come in, and showed him into a parlour. "Henny neem?" said the young man, pausing languidly at the door. It was a good thought, because, without providing the stranger, in case he should happen to be of a warm temper, with a sufficient excuse for knocking him down, it implied this young man's estimate of his quality, and relieved his breast of the oppressive burden of rating him in secret as a nameless and obscure individual. "Say her brother, if you please," said Tom. "Mother?" drawled the footman. "Brother," repeated Tom, slightly raising his voice. "And if you will say in the first instance a gentleman, and then say her brother, I shall be obliged to you, as she does not expect me or know I am in London, and I do not wish to startle her." The young man's interest in Tom's observations had ceased long before this time, but he kindly waited until now, when, shutting the door, he withdrew. "Dear me," said Tom, "this is very disrespectful and uncivil behavior. I hope these are new servants here, and that Ruth is very differently treated." His cogitations were interrupted by the sound of voices in the adjoining room. They seemed to be engaged in high dispute, or an indignant reprimand of some offender, and, gathering strength occasionally, broke out into a perfect whirlwind. It was in one of these gusts, as it appeared to Tom, that the footman announced him, for an abrupt and unnatural calm took place, and then a dead silence. He was standing before the window, wondering what domestic quarrel might have caused these sounds, and hoping Ruth had nothing to do with it, when the door opened, and his sister ran into his arms. "Why, bless my soul," said Tom, looking at her with great pride, when they had tenderly embraced each other, "how altered you are, Ruth! I should scarcely have known you, my love, if I had seen you anywhere else, I declare. You are so improved," said Tom, with inexpressible delight. "You are so womanly, you are so positively, you know, you are so handsome." "If you think so, Tom—" "Oh, but everybody must think so, you know," said Tom, gently smoothing down her hair. "It's a matter of fact, not opinion. But what's the matter?" said Tom, looking at her more intently. "How flushed you are! And you have been crying." "No, I have not, Tom." "Nonsense," said her brother stoutly. "That's a story. Don't tell me. I know better. What is it, dear?" "I'm not with Mr. Pecksniff now. I am going to try and settle myself in London. And if you are not happy here, as I very much fear you are not, for I begin to think you have been deceiving me with the kindest and most affectionate intention, you shall not remain here." Oh, Tom's blood was rising, mind that. Perhaps the boar's head had something to do with it, but certainly the footman had. So had the sight of his pretty sister a great deal to do with it. Tom could bear a good deal himself, but he was proud of her, and pride is a sensitive thing. He began to think, there are more Pecksniffs than one, perhaps. and by all the pins and needles that run up and down in angry veins, Tom was in a most unusual tingle all at once. "We will talk about it, Tom," said Ruth, giving him another kiss to pacify him. "I am afraid I cannot stay here." "Cannot?" replied Tom. "Why, then you shall not, my love. Heyday, you are not an object of charity, upon my word." Tom was stopped in these exclamations by the footman, who brought a message from his master, importing that he wished to speak with him before he went, and with Miss Pinch also. "Show the way," said Tom. "I'll wait upon him at once." Accordingly they entered the adjoining room, from which the noise of altercation had proceeded, and there they found a middle-aged gentleman with a pompous voice and manner, and a middle-aged lady with what may be termed an excisable face, or one in which starch and vinegar were decidedly employed. There was likewise present that eldest pupil of Miss Pinch, whom Mrs. Todgers on a previous occasion had called a syrup, and who was now weeping and sobbing spitefully. "My brother, sir," said Ruth Pinch, timidly presenting Tom. "Oh!" cried the gentleman, surveying Tom attentively. "You really are Miss Pinch's brother, I presume. You will excuse my asking. I don't observe any resemblance." "Miss Pinch has a brother, I know," observed the lady. "Miss Pinch is always talking about her brother when she ought to be engaged upon my education," sobbed the pupil. "Sophia, hold your tongue," observed the gentleman. "Sit down, if you please," addressing Tom. Tom sat down, looking from one face to another in mute surprise. "Remain here, if you please, Miss Pinch," pursued the gentleman, looking slightly over his shoulder. Tom interrupted him here by rising to place a chair for his sister, having done which he sat down again. "I am glad you chanced to have called to see your sister to-day, sir," resumed the brass and copper founder, "for although I do not approve, as a principle, of any young person engaged in my family in the capacity of a governess receiving visitors, it happens in this case to be well timed. I am sorry to inform you that we are not at all satisfied with your sister." "We are very much dissatisfied with her," observed the lady. "I'd never say another lesson to Miss Pinch if I was to be beat to death for it," sobbed the pupil. "Sophia," cried her father, "hold your tongue." "Will you allow me to inquire what your ground of dissatisfaction is?" asked Tom. "Yes," said the gentleman, "I will. I don't recognize it as a right, but I will. Your sister has not the slightest innate power of commanding respect. It has been a constant source of difference between us. Although she has been in this family for some time, and although the young lady who is now present has almost, as it were, grown up under her tuition, that young lady has no respect for her. Miss Pinch has been perfectly unable to command my daughter's respect or to win my daughter's confidence. Now," said the gentleman, allowing the palm of his hand to fall gravely down upon the table, "I maintain that there is something radically wrong in that. You, as her brother, may be disposed to deny it." "I beg your pardon, sir," said Tom. "I am not at all disposed to deny it. I am sure that there is something radically wrong, radically monstrous in that." "Good heavens!" cried the gentleman, looking round the room with dignity. "What do I find to be the case? What results obtrude themselves upon me as flowing from this weakness of character on the part of Miss Pinch? What are my feelings as a father when, after my desire, repeatedly expressed to Miss Pinch, as I think she will not venture to deny, that my daughter should be choice in her expressions, genteel in her deportment as becomes her station in life, and politely distant to her inferiors in society, I find her, only this very morning, addressing Miss Pinch herself as a beggar." "A beggarly thing," observed the lady in correction. "Which is worse," said the gentleman triumphantly. "Which is worse. A beggarly thing, a low, coarse, despicable expression." "Most despicable," cried Tom. "I am glad to find that there is a just appreciation of it here." "So just, sir," said the gentleman, lowering his voice to be the more impressive, "so just, that but for my knowing Miss Pinch to be an unprotected young person, an orphan and without friends, I would, as I assured Miss Pinch upon my veracity and personal character a few minutes ago, I would have severed the connection between us at that moment and from that time." "Bless my soul, sir," cried Tom, rising from his seat, for he was now unable to contain himself any longer, "don't allow such considerations as those to influence you, pray. They don't exist, sir. She is not unprotected. She is ready to depart this instant. Ruth, my dear, get your bonnet on." "Oh, a pretty family!" cried the lady. "Oh, he's her brother. There's no doubt about that." "As little doubt, madam," said Tom, "as that the young lady yonder is the child of your teaching, and not my sister's. Ruth, my dear, get your bonnet on." "When you say, young man," interposed the brass and copper founder haughtily, "with that impertinence which is natural to you, and which I therefore do not condescend to notice further, that the young lady, my eldest daughter, has been educated by any one but Miss Pinch, I needn't proceed. You comprehend me fully. I have no doubt you are used to it." "Sir," cried Tom, after regarding him in silence for some little time, "if you do not understand what I mean, I will tell you. If you do understand what I mean, I beg you not to repeat that mode of expressing yourself in answer to it. My meaning is, that no man can expect his children to respect what he degrades." "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed the gentleman. "Can't. The common can't." "The common story, sir?" said Tom. "The story of a common mind. Your governess cannot win the confidence and respect of your children, forsooth. Let her begin by winning yours, and see what happens then." "Miss Pinch is getting her bonnet on, I trust, my dear," said the gentleman. "I trust she is," said Tom, forestalling the reply. "I have no doubt she is. In the meantime I address myself to you, sir. You made your statement to me, sir. You required to see me for that purpose, and I have a right to answer it. I am not loud or turbulent," said Tom, which was quite true. "Though I can scarcely say as much for you in your manner of addressing yourself to me, and I wish, on my sister's behalf, to state the simple truth." "You may state anything you like, young man," returned the gentleman, affecting to yawn. "My dear, Miss Pinch's money—" "When you tell me," resumed Tom, who was not the less indignant for keeping himself quiet, "that my sister has no innate power of commanding the respect of your children, I must tell you it is not so, and that she has. She is as well bred, as well taught, as well qualified by nature to command respect as any hirer of a governess you know. But when you place her at a disadvantage in reference to every servant in your house, how can you suppose, if you have the gift of common sense, that she is not in a tenfold worse position in reference to your daughters?" "Pretty well, upon my word!" exclaimed the gentleman. "This is pretty well." "It is very ill, sir," said Tom. "It is very bad and mean and wrong and cruel. Respect! I believe young people are quick enough to observe and imitate, and why or how should they respect whom no one else respects, and everybody slights? And very partial they must grow, oh, very partial, to their studies, when they see to what a pass proficiency in those same tasks has brought their governess. Respect! Put anything the most deserving of respect before your daughters in the light in which you place her, and you will bring it down as low, no matter what it is." "You speak with extreme impertinence, young man," observed the gentleman. "I speak without passion, but with extreme indignation and contempt for such a course of treatment, and for all who practice it," said Tom. "Why, how can you, as an honest gentleman, profess displeasure or surprise at your daughter telling my sister she is something beggarly and humble, when you are forever telling her the same thing yourself in 50 plain outspeaking ways, though not in words, and when your very porter and footman make the same delicate announcement to all comers? As to your suspicion and distrust of her, even of her word, if she is not above their reach, you have no right to employ her." "No right!" cried the brass and copper founder. "Distinctly not," Tom answered. "If you imagine that the payment of an annual sum of money gives it to you, you immensely exaggerate its power and value. Your money is the least part of your bargain in such a case. You may be punctual in that to half a second on the clock, and yet be bankrupt. I have nothing more to say," said Tom, much flushed and flustered now that it was over, "except to crave permission to stand in your garden until my sister is ready." Not waiting to obtain it, Tom walked out. Before he had well begun to cool, his sister joined him. She was crying, and Tom could not bear that any one about the house should see her doing that. "They will think you are sorry to go," said Tom. "You are not sorry to go?" "No, Tom, no. I have been anxious to go for a very long time." "Very well, then, don't cry," said Tom. "I am so sorry for you, dear," sobbed Tom's sister. "But you ought to be glad on my account," said Tom. "I shall be twice as happy with you for a companion. Hold up your head. There. Now we go out as we ought, not blustering, you know, but firm and confident in ourselves." The idea of Tom and his sister blustering under any circumstances was a splendid absurdity, but Tom was very far from feeling it to be so in his excitement, and passed out at the gate with such severe determination written in his face that the porter hardly knew him again. It was not until they had walked some short distance, and Tom found himself getting cooler and more collected, that he was quite restored to himself by an inquiry from his sister, who said, in her pleasant little voice, "Where are we going, Tom?" "Dear me," said Tom, stopping, "I don't know." Don't you live anywhere, dear?" asked Tom's sister, looking wistfully in his face. "No," said Tom, "not at present, not exactly. I only arrived this morning. We must have some lodgings." He didn't tell her that he had been going to stay with his friend John, and could on no account think of billeting 2 inmates upon him, of whom one was a young lady, for he knew that would make her uncomfortable, and would cause her to regard herself as being an inconvenience to him. Neither did he like to leave her anywhere while he called on John, and told him of this change in his arrangements, for he was delicate of seeming to encroach upon the generous and hospitable nature of his friend. Therefore he said again, "We must have some lodgings, of course," and said it as stoutly as if he had been a perfect directory and guide book to all the lodgings in London. "Where shall we go and look for 'em?" said Tom. "What do you think?" Tom's sister was not much wiser on such a topic than he was, so she squeezed her little purse into his coat pocket, and folding the little hand with which she did so on the other little hand with which she clasped his arm, said nothing. "It ought to be a cheap neighborhood," said Tom, "and not too far from London. Let me see. Should you think Islington a good place?" "I should think it was an excellent place, Tom." "It used to be called Merry Islington once upon a time," said Tom. "Perhaps it's merry now. If so, it's all the better, eh?" "If it's not too dear," said Tom's sister. "Of course, if it's not too dear," assented Tom. "Well, where is Islington? We can't do better than go there, I should think. Let's go." Tom's sister would have gone anywhere with him, so they walked off arm in arm as comfortably as possible. Finding presently that Islington was not in that neighborhood, Tom made inquiries respecting a public conveyance thither, which they soon obtained. As they rode along they were very full of conversation indeed, Tom relating what had happened to him, and Tom's sister relating what had happened to her, and both finding a great deal more to say than time to say it in, for they had only just begun to talk, in comparison with what they had to tell each other, when they reached their journey's end. "Now," said Tom, "we must first look out for some very unpretending streets, and then look out for bills in the windows." So they walked off again, quite as happily as if they had just stepped out of a snug little house of their own to look for lodgings on account of somebody else. Tom's simplicity was unabated, heaven knows, but now that he had somebody to rely upon him, he was stimulated to rely a little more upon himself, and was, in his own opinion, quite a desperate fellow. After roaming up and down for hours, looking at some scores of lodgings, they began to find it rather fatiguing, especially as they saw none which were at all adapted to their purpose. At length, however, in a singular little old-fashioned house up a blind street, they discovered 2 small bedrooms and a triangular parlour, which promised to suit them well enough. Their desiring to take possession immediately was a suspicious circumstance, but even this was surmounted by the payment of their first week's rent, and a reference to John Westlock, Esquire, Furnival's Inn, High Holborn. Ah, it was a goodly sight, when this important point was settled, to behold Tom and his sister trotting round to the baker's, and the butcher's, and the grocer's, with a kind of dreadful delight in the unaccustomed cares of housekeeping, taking secret counsel together as they gave their small orders, and distracted by the least suggestion on the part of the shopkeeper. When they got back to the triangular parlour, and Tom's sister, bustling to and fro, busy about 1,000 pleasant nothings, stopped every now and then to give old Tom a kiss or smile upon him, Tom rubbed his hands as if all Islington were his. It was late in the afternoon now, though, and high time for Tom to keep his appointment. So, after agreeing with his sister that in consideration of not having dined, they would venture on the extravagance of chops for supper at 9, he walked out again to narrate these marvellous occurrences to John. "I am quite a family man all at once," thought Tom. "If I can only get something to do, how comfortable Ruth and I may be. Ah, that if. But it's of no use to despond. I can but do that when I have tried everything and failed, and even then it won't serve me much. Upon my word, thought Tom, quickening his pace, I don't know what John will think has become of me. He'll begin to be afraid I have strayed into one of those streets where the countrymen are murdered, and that I have been made meat pies of, or some such horrible thing. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 37. Tom Pinch, going astray, finds that he is not the only person in that predicament. He retaliates upon a fallen foe. Tom's evil genius did not lead him into the dens of any of those preparers of cannibalic pastry who are represented in many standard country legends as doing a lively retail business in the metropolis. Nor did it mark him out as the prey of ring-droppers, pea and thimble riggers, duffers, touters, or any of those bloodless sharpers who are, perhaps, a little better known to the police. He fell into conversation with no gentleman who took him into a public-house, where there happened to be another gentleman who swore he had more money than any gentleman, and very soon proved he had more money than one gentleman by taking his away from him. Neither did he fall into any other of the numerous man-traps which are set up without notice in the public grounds of this city. But he lost his way. He very soon did that, and in trying to find it again he lost it more and more. Now Tom, in his guileless distrust of London, thought himself very knowing in coming to the determination that he would not ask to be directed to Furnival's Inn, if he could help it, unless indeed he should happen to find himself near the Mint or the Bank of England, in which case he would step in and ask a civil question or two, confiding in the perfect respectability of the concern. So on he went, looking up all the streets he came near and going up half of them, and thus, by dint of not being true to Goswell Street, and filing off into Aldermanbury, and bewildering himself in Barbican, and being constant to the wrong point of the compass in London Wall, and then getting himself crosswise into Thames Street by an instinct that would have been marvellous if he had had the least desire or reason to go there, he found himself at last hard by the Monument. The man in the Monument was quite as mysterious a being to Tom as the man in the moon. It immediately occurred to him that the lonely creature who held himself aloof from all mankind in that pillar like some old hermit was the very man of whom to ask his way. Cold he might be, little sympathy he had, perhaps, with human passion. The columns seemed too tall for that. But if truth didn't live in the base of the Monument, notwithstanding Pope's couplet about the outside of it, where in London, thought Tom, was she likely to be found? Coming close below the pillar, it was a great encouragement to Tom to find that the man in the Monument had simple tastes. That stony and artificial as his residence was, he still preserved some rustic recollections. That he liked plants, hung up bird cages, was not wholly cut off from fresh groundsel, and kept young trees in tubs. The man in the Monument himself was sitting outside the door, his own door, the Monument door. What a grand idea! And was actually yawning as if there were no monument to stop his mouth and give him a perpetual interest in his own existence. Tom was advancing towards this remarkable creature to inquire the way to Furnival's Inn, when two people came to see the Monument. They were a gentleman and a lady, and the gentleman said, "How much apiece?" The man in the Monument replied, "A tanner." It seemed a low expression compared with the Monument. The gentleman put a shilling into his hand, and the man in the Monument opened a dark little door. When the gentleman and lady had passed out of view, he shut it again, and came slowly back to his chair. He sat down and laughed. "They don't know what a many steps there is," he said. It's worth twice the money to stop here. Oh, my eye!" The man in the monument was a cynic, a worldly man. Tom couldn't ask his way of him. He was prepared to put no confidence in anything he said. "My gracious!" cried a well-known voice behind Mr. Pinch. "Why, to be sure it is!" At the same time he was poked in the back by a parasol. Turning round to inquire into this salute, he beheld the eldest daughter of his late patron. "Miss Pecksniff," said Tom. "Why, my goodness, Mr. Pinch!" cried Cherry. "What are you doing here?" "I have rather wandered from my way," said Tom. I hope you have run away," said Charity. "It would be quite spirited and proper if you had, when my papa so far forgets himself." "I have left him," returned Tom, but it was perfectly understood on both sides. It was not done clandestinely. "Is he married?" asked Cherry, with a spasmodic shake of her chin. "No, not yet," said Tom, coloring. "To tell you the truth, I don't think he is likely to be, if Miss Graham is the object of his passion." "Tch, Mr. Pinch!" cried Charity with sharp impatience. "You're very easily deceived. You don't know the arts of which such a creature is capable. Oh, it's a wicked world." "You are not married?" Tom hinted, to divert the conversation. "No," said Cherry, tracing out one particular paving stone in Monument Yard with the end of her parasol. But really it's quite impossible to explain. Won't you walk in?" "You live here, then?" said Tom. "Yes," returned Miss Pecksniff, pointing with her parasol to Todgers's. "I reside with this lady at present." The great stress on the two last words suggested to Tom that he was expected to say something in reference to them. So he said, "Only at present? Are you going home again soon?" "No, Mr. Pinch," returned Charity. "No, thank you, no. A mother-in-law who is younger than, I mean to say, who is as nearly as possible about the same age as one's self, would not quite suit my spirit. Not quite," said Cherry, with a spiteful shiver. "I thought from your saying 'at present,'" Tom observed. "Really, upon my word, I had no idea you would press me so very closely on the subject, Mr. Pinch," said Charity, blushing, "or I should not have been so foolish as to allude to Oh, really, won't you walk in?" Tom mentioned, to excuse himself, that he had an appointment in Furnival's Inn, and that coming from Islington he had taken a few wrong turnings and arrived at the Monument instead. Miss Pecksniff simpered very much when he asked her if she knew the way to Furnival's Inn, and at length found courage to reply. "A gentleman who is a friend of mine, or at least who is not exactly a friend so much as a sort of acquaintance Oh, upon my word, I hardly know what I say, Mr. Pinch. You mustn't suppose there is any engagement between us, or at least if there is, that it is at all a settled thing as yet, is going to Furnival's Inn immediately, I believe, upon a little business, and I am sure he would be very glad to accompany you, so as to prevent your going wrong again. You had better walk in. You will very likely find my sister Mary here," she said with a curious toss of her head, and anything but an agreeable smile. "Then I think I'll endeavour to find my way alone," said Tom, "for I fear she would not be very glad to see me. That unfortunate occurrence, in relation to which you and I had some amicable words together in private, is not likely to have impressed her with any friendly feeling towards me, though it really was not my fault." "She has never heard of that, you may depend," said Cherry, gathering up the corners of her mouth and nodding at Tom. "I am far from sure that she would bear you any mighty ill will for it if she had." "You don't say so!" cried Tom, who was really concerned by this insinuation. "I say nothing," said Charity. "If I had not already known what shocking things treachery and deceit are in themselves, Mr. Pinch, I might perhaps have learnt it from the success they meet with. Here she smiled as before. "But I don't say anything. On the contrary, I should scorn it. You had better walk in." There was something hidden here which piqued Tom's interest and troubled his tender heart. When, in a moment's irresolution, he looked at Charity, he could not but observe a struggle in her face between a sense of triumph and a sense of shame, nor could he but remark how, meeting even his eyes, which she cared so little for, she turned away her own, for all this splenetic defiance in her manner. An uneasy thought entered Tom's head, a shadowy misgiving that the altered relations between himself and Pecksniff were somehow to involve an altered knowledge on his part of other people, and were to give him an insight into much of which he had had no previous suspicion. And yet he put no definite construction upon Charity's proceedings. He certainly had no idea that, as he had been the audience and spectator of her mortification, she grasped with eager delight at any opportunity of reproaching her sister with his presence in her far deeper misery. For he knew nothing of it, and only pictured that sister as the same giddy, careless, trivial creature she always had been, with the same slight estimation of himself which she had never been at the least pains to conceal. In short, he had merely a confused impression that Miss Pecksniff was not quite sisterly or kind, and being curious to set it right, accompanied her as she desired. The house door being opened, she went in before Tom, requesting him to follow her, and led the way to the parlor door. "Oh, Mary," she said, looking in, "I am so glad you have not gone home. Who do you think I have met in the street and brought to see you? Mr. Pinch. There! Now you are surprised, I am sure." Not more surprised than Tom was when he looked upon her. Not so much. Not half so much. "Mr. Pinch has left papa, my dear," said Cherry, "and his prospects are quite flourishing. I have promised that Augustus, who is going that way, shall escort him to the place he wants. Augustus, my child, where are you?" With these words Miss Pecksniff screamed her way out of the parlor, calling on Augustus Model to appear, and left Tom Pinch alone with her sister. If she had always been his kindest friend, if she had treated him through all his servitude with such consideration as was never yet received by struggling man, if she had lightened every moment of those many years, and had ever spared and never wounded him, his honest heart could not have swelled before her with a deeper pity or a purer freedom from all base remembrance than it did then. "My gracious me! You are really the last person in the world I should have thought of seeing, I am sure." Tom was sorry to hear her speaking in her old manner. He had not expected that. Yet he did not feel it a contradiction that he should be sorry to see her so unlike her old self, and sorry at the same time to hear her speaking in her old manner. The two things seemed quite natural. "I wonder you find any gratification in coming to see me. I can't think what put it in your head. I never had much in seeing you. There was no love lost between us, Mr. Pinch, at any time, I think." Her bonnet lay beside her on the sofa, and she was very busy with the ribbons as she spoke. Much too busy to be conscious of the work her fingers did. "We never quarreled," said Tom. Tom was right in that, for one person can no more quarrel without an adversary than one person can play at chess or fight a duel. "I hoped you would be glad to shake hands with an old friend. Don't let us rake up bygones," said Tom. "If I ever offended you, forgive me." She looked at him for a moment, dropped her bonnet from her hands, spread them before her altered face, and burst into tears. "Oh, Mr. Pinch," she said, "although I never used you well, I did believe your nature was forgiving. I did not think you could be cruel." She spoke as little like her old self now, for certain, as Tom could possibly have wished, but she seemed to be appealing to him reproachfully, and he did not understand her. "I seldom showed it. Never. I know that. But I had that belief in you that if I had been asked to name the person in the world least likely to retort upon me, I would have named you confidently." "Would have named me?" Tom repeated. "Yes," she said with energy, "and I have often thought so." After a moment's reflection, Tom sat himself upon a chair beside her. "Do you believe," said Tom, "oh, can you think that what I said just now I said with any but the true and plain intention which my words professed? I mean it in the spirit and the letter. If I ever offended you, forgive me. I may have done so many times. You never injured or offended me. How then could I possibly retort, if even I were stern and bad enough to wish to do it?" After a little while she thanked him, through her tears and sobs, and told him she had never been at once so sorry and so comforted since she left home. Still she wept bitterly, and it was the greater pain to Tom to see her weeping, from her standing in especial need just then of sympathy and tenderness. "Come, come," said Tom. "You used to be as cheerful as the day was long." "Ah, used!" she cried in such a tone as rent Tom's heart. "And will be again," said Tom. "No, never more. No, never, never more." "If you should talk with old Mr. Chuzzlewit at any time," she added, looking hurriedly into his face. "I sometimes thought he liked you, but suppressed it. Will you promise me to tell him that you saw me here, and that I said I bore in mind the time we talked together in the churchyard?" Tom promised that he would. Many times since then, when I have wished I had been carried there before that day, I have recalled his words. I wish that he should know how true they were, although the least acknowledgment to that effect has never passed my lips and never will. Tom promised this, conditionally too. He did not tell her how improbable it was that he and the old man would ever meet again, because he thought it might disturb her more. "If he should ever know this, through your means, dear Mr. Pinch," said Mercy, "tell him that I sent the message, not for myself, but that he might be more forbearing and more patient, and more trustful to some other person in some other time of need. Tell him that if he could know how my heart trembled in the balance that day, and what a very little would have turned the scale, his own would bleed with pity for me." "Yes, yes," said Tom, "I will." "When I appeared to him the most unworthy of his help, I know I was, for I have often thought about it since, the most inclined to yield to what he showed me. Oh, if he had relented but a little more! If he had thrown himself in my way for but one other quarter of an hour! If he had extended his compassion for a vain, unthinking, miserable girl in but the least degree, he might, and I believe he would, have saved her. Tell him that I don't blame him, but am grateful for the effort that he made. But ask him, for the love of God and youth, and in merciful consideration for the struggle which an ill-advised and unwakened nature makes to hide the strength it thinks its weakness, ask him never, never to forget this when he deals with one again." Although Tom did not hold the clue to her full meaning, he could guess it pretty nearly. Touched to the quick, he took her hand and said, or meant to say, some words of consolation. She felt and understood them, whether they were spoken or no. He was not quite certain afterwards, but that she had tried to kneel down at his feet and bless him. He found that he was not alone in the room when she had left it. Mrs. Todgers was there, shaking her head. Tom had never seen Mrs. Todgers, it is needless to say, but he had a perception of her being the lady of the house, and he saw some genuine compassion in her eyes that won his good opinion. "Ah, sir, you are an old friend, I see," said Mrs. Todgers. "Yes," said Tom. "And yet," quoth Mrs. Todgers, shutting the door softly, "she hasn't told you what her troubles are, I'm certain." Tom was struck by these words, for they were quite true. "Indeed," he said, "she has not." "And never would," said Mrs. Todgers, "if you saw her daily. She never makes the least complaint to me, or utters a single word of explanation or reproach. But I know," said Mrs. Todgers, drawing in her breath. "I know." Tom nodded sorrowfully. "So do I." "I fully believe," said Mrs. Todgers, taking her pocket handkerchief from the flat reticule, "that nobody can tell one half of what that poor young creature has to undergo. But though she comes here constantly to ease her poor full heart without his knowing it, and saying, 'Mrs. Todgers, I am very low to-day. I think that I shall soon be dead,' sits crying in my room until the fit is past. I know no more from her, and I believe," said Mrs. Todgers, putting back her handkerchief again, "that she considers me a good friend too." Mrs. Todgers might have said her best friend. Commercial gentlemen and gravy had tried Mrs. Todgers's temper. The main chance, it was such a very small one in her case that she might have been excused for looking sharp after it, lest it should entirely vanish from her sight, had taken a firm hold on Mrs. Todgers's attention. But in some odd nook in Mrs. Todgers's breast, up a great many steps, and in a corner easy to be overlooked, there was a secret door, with "Woman" written on the spring, which, at a touch from Mercy's hand, had flown wide open and admitted her for shelter. When boarding-house accounts are balanced with all other ledgers, and the books of the recording angel are made up for ever, perhaps there may be seen an entry to thy credit, lean Mrs. Todgers, which shall make thee beautiful. She was growing beautiful so rapidly in Tom's eyes, for he saw that she was poor, and that this good had sprung up in her from among the sordid strivings of her life, that she might have been a very Venus in a minute more, if Miss Pecksniff had not entered with her friend. "Mr. Thomas Pinch," said Charity, performing the ceremony of introduction with evident pride. "Mr. Model. Where's my sister?" "Gone, Miss Pecksniff," Mrs. Todgers answered. She had appointed to be home. "Ah," said Charity, looking at Tom. "Oh, dear me." "She's greatly altered since she's been married, Mrs. Todgers," observed Model. "My dear Augustus," said Miss Pecksniff in a low voice, "I verily believe you have said that 50,000 times in my hearing. What a prose you are!" This was succeeded by some trifling love passages, which appeared to originate with, if not to be wholly carried on, by Miss Pecksniff. At any rate, Mr. Model was much slower in his responses than is customary with young lovers, and exhibited a lowness of spirits which was quite oppressive. He did not improve at all when Tom and he were in the streets, but sighed so dismally that it was dreadful to hear him. As a means of cheering him up, Tom told him that he wished him joy. "Joy!" cried Model. "Ha, ha!" "What an extraordinary young man!" thought Tom. "The scorner has not set his seal upon you. You care what becomes of you," said Model. Tom admitted that it was a subject in which he certainly felt some interest. "I don't," said Mr. Model. "The elements may have me when they please. I'm ready." Tom inferred from these and other expressions of the same nature that he was jealous. Therefore he allowed him to take his own course, which was such a gloomy one that he felt a load removed from his mind when they parted company at the gate of Furnival's Inn. It was now a couple of hours past John Westlock's dinner time, and he was walking up and down the room quite anxious for Tom's safety. The table was spread, the wine was carefully decanted, and the dinner smelt delicious. "Why, Tom, old boy, where on earth have you been? Your box is here. Get your boots off instantly and sit down." "I am sorry to say I can't stay, John," replied Tom Pinch, who was breathless with the haste he had made in running up the stairs. "Can't stay?" "If you'll go on with your dinner," said Tom, "I'll tell you my reason the while. I mustn't eat myself, or I shall have no appetite for the chops." "There are no chops here, my good fellow." "No, but there are at Islington," said Tom. John Westlock was perfectly confounded by this reply, and vowed he would not touch a morsel until Tom had explained himself fully. So Tom sat down and told him all, to which he listened with the greatest interest. He knew Tom too well, and respected his delicacy too much, to ask him why he had taken these measures without communicating with him first. He quite concurred in the expediency of Tom's immediately returning to his sister, as he knew so little of the place in which he had left her, and good-humouredly proposed to ride back with him in a cab, in which he might convey his box. Tom's proposition that he should sup with them that night he flatly rejected, but made an appointment with him for the morrow. "And now, Tom," he said, as they rode along, "I have a question to ask you, to which I expect a manly and straightforward answer. Do you want any money? I am pretty sure you do." "I don't indeed," said Tom. "I believe you are deceiving me." "No, with many thanks to you, I am quite in earnest," Tom replied. "My sister has some money, and so have I. If I had nothing else, John, I have a £5 note which that good creature Mrs. Lupin, of the Dragon, handed up to me outside the coach, in a letter begging me to borrow it, and then drove off as hard as she could go." "And a blessing on every dimple in her handsome face, say I," cried John, "though why you should give her the preference over me, I don't know. Never mind, I bide my time, Tom." "And I hope you'll continue to bide it," returned Tom gaily, "for I owe you more already in 100 other ways than I can ever hope to pay." They parted at the door of Tom's new residence. John Westlock, sitting in the cab and catching a glimpse of a blooming little busy creature darting out to kiss Tom and to help him with his box, would not have had the least objection to change places with him. Well, she was a cheerful little thing, and had a quaint, bright quietness about her that was infinitely pleasant. Surely she was the best sauce for chops ever invented. The potatoes seemed to take a pleasure in sending up their grateful steam before her. The froth upon the pint of porter pouted to attract her notice. But it was all in vain. She saw nothing but Tom. Tom was the first and last thing in the world. As she sat opposite to Tom at supper, fingering one of Tom's pet tunes upon the tablecloth, and smiling in his face, he had never been so happy in his life. End of chapter 37.